Yeah.
Yeah. How's it going?
It's going okay. It's going okay.
Yeah.
Busy, but
You got public service loan forgiveness.
I did. That was probably the most exciting thing that happened in 2021. Like the initial reports were that like basically like nobody was actually like nobody who thought they were eligible was actually getting forgiveness, and I was like, oh my god, is this
Yeah.
actually going to work? And it didn't
Did,
seem feasible.
how, did that steer you off course? That stuff? The fact that the media was blasting it and saying 99% of applications denied,
Not
or
really, because I felt like I think I assumed that I had done my homework in terms of like having my stuff in the right loans and having my documentation. So I think my hope
yeah,
at that time was that the reason that people weren't getting forgiven was just because their documentation was off or their understanding of how the program worked was off. So I think I
right.
was still relatively optimistic. And I kind of
Good.
felt like, well, okay, worst case scenario, if it turns out that like this isn't going to work, then at that point in time, I'm going to start figuring out what's my next path. Like, how do I then
Yeah.
go about deciding how to pay these off?
I think back when did you start medical school? What year?
2006.
Oh, 06. Yep. So there was not, well, public service loan forgiveness didn't get uh created until 07.
Okay.
And
Okay.
then really until 2010 it didn't kind of hit the critical mass of people are using income driven repayments. The schools are teaching it. That's when I joined Mike's team
Yeah.
and started teaching it at medical schools was
I remember when
2010.
that rolled out.
Yeah. So can I fire a few questions at you
Of
if you don't
course.
if you don't mind? This is
I
great.
don't
I
mind at
really
all.
thank you for taking a few minutes to talk to me. Hopefully
Yeah.
you're elated about this thing and want to talk
Yeah.
about it anyway. And I think a lot of people in your shoes that are pursuing it, that have seen this media attention that is often negative towards PSLF will breathe a sigh of relief when they hear a real case study, a real story of its success. How much did you end up getting forgiven?
It was about $130,000 that I had left in loans that got forgiven.
That's awesome. Congrats. I applaud your effort towards it, because those 10 years that you did are a lot more difficult than the 10 years that are coming down the road for people to do now that everybody has the right kind of loans if they've gone to school in the past 11 years.
Yeah.
Your path was a little rockier than that'll be for borrowers that are like finishing up school today.
Right.
What repayment plan did you end up using throughout? Did you use the same one the whole time and just renew it?
I used the same plan. I renewed it. I think there were a total of 4 different servicers that ended up
Wow.
having it. And I think this is like ages ago, but I think when I initially said like I'm going into this, I had to switch everything into the like what is now like the Fed loans stuff. But at the
Yep.
time it was, there was Vermont I was in, there was like
Yep.
another one before that I was in that.
Yeah, the consolidation happened aggressively probably 6, 7 years ago, where there was dozens of servicers, and all of a sudden they all consolidated into basically the four main ones that exist today, which is changing later this year. But Fed Loans, Navient, Nelnet, or Great Lakes. So
Yeah.
if you were doing the employment certification form, that's when they landed at Fed Loans.
Yep.
But do you recall like how many years was it with Fed Loans where you were actually tracking those payments towards the 120 qualified to forgive?
So when I first got in with Fed loans, I want to say it was maybe around 2015.
Okay.
And at that point in time, I had moved back up to Massachusetts. So I didn't have the info from my residency, which counted.
Yep.
So I had to get information from residency, which was probably the hardest piece of it, like figuring out who to talk to there to get
At your residency program?
What's that?
At your residency program? Who did it end up being? Was it GME or
GME?
Okay,
but,
good.
The
We
GME
like to hear that.
like they were very hard to reach in general. I had a name change, which had confused some things because the all of my information from them was in my maiden name, but my loans I had switched to my married name. So like I had to submit like all this documentation to them for that. And then once I had that piece done, that was for those 4 years.
Mhm.
I've been at the same job since then. So that made that easier because each year I was just basically saying,
Yeah. Now, reconciling your residency. So you did, it was an OBGYN residency. You did 4 years.
Yeah.
Did you consolidate your loans right after med school
I did.
into a single loan? Got it.
I had
We usually do
I had
that for
two
folks
loans that were like the same servicer and everything like that, but
Yeah.
I had two loans.
Do you feel like if you had not consolidated, and I don't know what your loans look like from 06 to 2010, but they could have been not Department of Education loans. That didn't happen until 2010.
Yeah.
So the consolidation was necessary for PSLF, but the consolidation was probably suggested to you
It was, yeah.
by
It
your
was not
school.
something no, it was suggested to me by Mike, I think.
It was okay. Got it.
In order to do this. And I think I remember doing a little bit of research on like, okay, how do I get to a point where this all kind of will
Yep.
gel for this? And it was like, yeah, you have to consolidate your loans.
So it was good for you to have Mike in your corner
Oh yeah.
at that time, because 2010 was a year when it started to hit critical mass. Schools started to teach it, but not everybody knew that those loans from 06 to 2010 often weren't qualified unless they were consolidated. So that's an interesting point for you specifically.
Yeah.
Now today, everybody has already Department of Education loans, so they may want to consolidate for convenience,
Right.
administrative simplicity.
Yeah.
So another question for you is, if Fed Loans wasn't your servicer for those first roughly 4 or 5 years, when you completed the employment certification form and then Fed Loans became your servicer, did you have any issues getting Fed Loans to count payments that were made in the income-driven plan with the previous servicer? Did that require any chasing for you?
Surprisingly not. It actually,
I love to hear that.
Yeah, it was a really smooth transition there. I had all of my documentation from the prior loan servicers, and so I forwarded that to them and then had to verify my employment. But
Yep.
that was their standard form, which they're still using today for like employment verification.
That's great to hear, especially because this matters to you not at all now, which is awesome.
Right.
But the Fed Loans has announced that they're leaving federal loan servicing in like later this year in December.
Oh, wow.
So there's a little unrest around who's going to take it over. Or is all the data going to be accurate? Are we going to have to chase down information again? And I think that they've got things well in order with, we're hoping that Mohella, another servicer, takes it over, but this is all inconsequential to you. Now you're done.
No.
Now, when you applied for public service loan forgiveness, so in other words, 120 payments were complete.
Yeah.
Was that proactively communicated to you by the servicer to go fill out that application? Did you just see that you had hit 120 and it was time to fill out the application? What was that like?
Yeah, so I had always had this kind of tally in my head of like, at this point, I'm going to reach this. And I think for the first 6 months of my residency, I had my loans in forbearance, which had been recommended to me maybe by med school. I don't remember who gave me that recommendation. So I knew it wasn't like as soon as I hit 10 years out of med school, I knew I had like a little bit of cushion there that I
could have been your grace period too, right? You have a grace period and that doesn't count. So for a lot of times, doctors that are going right into residency or their intern year want to consolidate because grace period doesn't count for PSLF, but income driven does.
Right. And so I think I had been encouraged to take that. So I had taken that. And so then I was like, okay, I know it's not exactly that. So maybe 3 years ago, I had, sent in my employment verification stuff and they said, okay, you're at X number of payments. So I knew I was relatively close. And I think I had calculated that it was going to be, around May, June or so. And so when I hit the 120, if I logged into the website, I could see that I had hit it. But I think I had already started the process of like applying before I even got an email from them saying like, we think you might be at 120 payments. So.
They did send you an email like that said, though, we think you might be done with this thing. Here's the application.
Yeah, they sent me an email saying that I had like a new message in my inbox. And
Nice.
so I had to like log in, and then when I saw like, this says that you've reached 120 payments. If you feel like this is correct, you can submit for forgiveness. And that part wasn't super crystal clear, that like you had to fill out the same form that it looked like you've been filling out when you were doing your like certification employment. It was basically the exact same form again. Because I was kind of like, well, I just filled this out last month to say that I had like 119 payments.
Yeah.
So now I guess I'm doing this for like the 120th payment, and, just for the proof that I'm still employed.
Yeah. They consolidated those forms essentially. And even there was this temporary expanded public service loan forgiveness. If you had done the wrong repayment plan for some reason, but you could blame that on your loan servicer, they're still forgiving some of those loans for people now. Yeah. But you had a nice clean trajectory of 10 consecutive years. And this is this is great. Now, from the time you applied to the time you saw a zero balance, or how is that communicated to you? I want to do fireworks and bottle popping and
right. Yeah, no, it was similarly, there was like a message in your inbox.
Yep.
And it was fast. It was like maybe 8 or 9 days after I submitted it, maybe even a little bit sooner. And it was the same thing. It was an email that just said, like you have a new message in your inbox. When I went to the inbox, it said like your loans have been forgiven. And then when I looked on the site, because of course I'm like, I don't believe this. Like this is like, until somebody says like this is truly like,
want to see it.
So I looked on, and it was like a zero balance, and that was it.
Wow. So 8 or 9 days, that is faster than I would have expected. Around what time did that happen? Was this during the pandemic?
It was just in August of this year.
Okay. This just happened 2 months ago.
Yeah. This is like really
not even. Wow.
Yeah.
That's incredible, Gina. So I'm glad to know. I mean, maybe because the servicers aren't servicing student loans right now, everybody's in a zero payment situation.
Yeah, maybe they had extra staff. I also don't know if it helps that I had like certified my employment at like 119 payments. So like I had already, it wasn't like they had to go back through the last 3 years of my employment to verify that. Like that was all current.
Loaded question. Do you feel like HRs or other admins at qualified employers should be aware of this and proactively, maybe just once a year, reaching out and saying, hey, if you're pursuing PSLF, we'll fill out this form for you, maybe go through and do the numbers again to make sure you're in the right repayment plan, because that's a retention tool for them.
Yeah. And I think as an employment strategy, I think it would be a great thing. If I am thinking about coming to a, public service institution.
Yeah.
And, you want to sell every perk, because there's going to be a lot of parts of that job that are work and not perks. And so if that was something that was touted as I signed, like, hey, by the way, don't know what your loan situation is or whether you're paying back, but, this employment counts towards this. If you, can reconfigure your loans and things like that, then it would be great. I don't know how many people would necessarily choose the position solely so that they can get that, because I think you're really choosing a very different career path in some circumstances.
Yeah.
And for me, I always knew I was going to end up in academic medicine. I knew that I wanted to be at a university institution. I knew that I wanted to take care of like the Medicare, Medicaid population. So that was always going to happen. But if I'm, choosing between two different places, and a place says to me, hey, like we will help make this process easy for you.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's a no-brainer.
For you, public service loan forgiveness was an ancillary benefit of a career trajectory you were already choosing. So it's good that you learned about it when you graduated medical school to position yourself properly. It wasn't so easy to do in 2010 because a lot of people didn't have the right kind of loans. They needed to consolidate them, and the income-driven plans were still kind of confusing to people. So if you could advise anybody that's finishing up school with a whole bunch of student loan debt, 6 figures, comfortable 6 figures, and well, certainly for doctors going into training where your income is modest for X number of years while you train. Do you have any other advice for people if you go viral? And which I hope you might be comfortable with that, because there's a lot of thirst for information on this topic. I won't give away your contact info.
Yeah. So I think the biggest things for me were like having your documentation, like being on top of your documentation, because it's just so much easier if you keep track of that. And it doesn't take a lot of time, but like staying current on things. I think thinking about as you reach that point where you're no longer making a resident salary, like as you move into an attending role, thinking about how you're going to manage your taxes, how you're going to manage that, because that all plays into your income-based repayment.
Yeah.
For most people, that's a pretty big jump in what you have to pay from like what you're paying in residency to then what you have to pay as an attending. So just be mindful of that as you're like financially planning your life and how that's going to look. I think is an important thing to consider, because even though it's still better than like what you would often be repaying in another system,
Sure.
and you're like in 10 years, like this money is no longer going to be an issue. You still have to be prepared that like that's going to be a bill that you didn't have.
Yeah.
Going into that.
So essentially, in residency, you can pay as little as zero. Some people pay in their intern year if they had taxes that showed no income their last year in medical school. And then once you have an attending role where your income hopefully goes up substantially, then your payments obviously are going to follow that and go up as well. You're not in some relief program that isn't requiring payments from you, and you have to budget for that. Absolutely. Yeah. And the outcome is still more desirable than having to pay it all back, but it's something that you have to still economically, financially prepare for.
Right. Absolutely. You know, you're looking for that future of not having those payments, but you still have to make those payments in the interim. Yeah. And so you need that sort of short-term pain for the longer term reward of not having to pay down the road. But especially, I think, you know, a lot of us are so science-minded. We're not always the most financially minded. So that idea of like, you may have to budget for this. You may have to think about, you know, like what is your partner doing in terms of like contributing, or, you know, how does that all play in? A lot of people coming out of residency are starting families, so you're going to have different expenses there. So I think just being mindful of that shift when that happens, and kind of, you know, preemptively preparing for that when you do have those lower payments in residency, I think is a helpful strategy to avoid really like you're spending, you know, for some people, if they only have a 3-year residency, that might be 7 years where you are actually, you know, paying back a little bit more. Yeah.
We like to project out the payments based on your future income, whether that's you're finishing residency and you've done 3 or 4 years, and then you have 6 or 7 more to go. Project those payments versus what you owe to see what's the delta of, is the savings substantial there, so that you can prepare for it that way. Because that is a shocker. All of a sudden, $300 a month turns to $2,200 a month, or whatever the number is. That happens overnight, based on you when you recertify.
What happened for me was that big jump.
For sure. Yep. And it still results in savings, so it's a good economic outcome, but you have to be prepared for that. So that's a great point. Did you have, if I may ask these sort of invasive questions, but married, did you go through the married filing jointly versus separately complexity conundrum? What'd you choose?
We chose to file separately.
Okay.
Which has worked for us. I'm happy that we'll be filing jointly going forward, because it's big with kids and a house and all of those other things.
Sure.
But we did choose to file separately the whole time that I was in the repayment plan. Okay. So that kept your payments lower, maximized savings. And as far as you could tell, without getting into the personal details, but, you know, filing married and separately, it will never be cheaper than filing jointly, but often it's not that much more expensive to where you're saving 6 figures on your student loans. It still makes sense to do that. Absolutely. And it's hard to, I think it's hard to really quantify that, because, you know, like you have to take your deductions differently. You know, it changes once you have dependency, it changes like who, you know, says that like puts the dependence on their tax
You're
return.
able to claim the dependents and make the payments maybe a little bit lower as well, which helps. Yep.
Right. And so that was for me, like not knowing a ton about taxes, like that was something that I really had to like, okay, like where does this make sense? Who
Sure.
do these kids be under, and like all that kind of stuff. The nuance of that was a little bit more complex, but we figured that it would mean that the payments were lower overall.
Yeah. That's super helpful, because that is a complexity for people, or a conundrum. Do we want to file separately? Is it going to subject us to greater tax liability? And often when you're talking about comfortable six figures of savings, more often than not, it makes sense to file separately, but not always. So that's a consideration that people should also be prepared for.
Yeah.
Well, you've been super generous with your time. You're okay that I recorded this?
Yeah, that's fine.
Yeah. Okay. But yeah, I think a lot of people will benefit from hearing your story, and even that you hear all the nightmare stories in the media about people getting denied and it taking forever and having the wrong kinds of loans. And that stuff has been out there, but the expectation is that your outcome is going to become increasingly common.
Yeah.
There's 1.3 million people enrolled in this program now, but there's still around maybe even a little less than 10,000 that have gotten their loans forgiven. So you're in this clinical trial sort of group, if you will.
Yeah.
And it's awesome to hear a success story. So you'll have to tell Mike I said hi, and hopefully I did okay in this interview thing. I'm not like a trained interviewer. But
I'm not a trained interviewee.
No, hey, I feel like you did great. I did buy this podcasting mic, so I kind of nerd out like I am a.
You gotta look the look, right?
Yeah, exactly. If I'm gonna do an interview, I gotta have something that makes it official, right? Well, really nice to talk to you, Dr. Gina Sullivan, and very much appreciate your time, and congratulations on getting loan forgiveness. And yes, please tell Mike I said hello.
I will. Take care.
All right.
Have a good one. Bye.
All right, everyone, thanks for tuning in. If you are a PSLF candidate or think you will be down the road, you can register for one-on-one support with an advisor with Doctors Without Quarters. That's www.dwoq.com. Their experience and dedication towards the Public Service Loan Forgiveness Program will ensure that you maximize the substantial savings opportunity that's often available there. Also want to, if you're a qualified employer, point your attention towards www.PSLFjobs.com. PSLF Jobs is the nation's first jobs platform and resource dedicated exclusively to the Public Service Loan Forgiveness Program. So that's all we have for you today. But remember, until debt do us part.